Hello, all. So we're going to start out chapter 25 here by talking about the age of nationalism in France. And it actually requires a little bit of a recap from what we studied in chapter 23. So looking at the status of France at the end of the 1848 revolutions. So the government at this point is called the Second French Republic. Remember, the first French Republic was formed during the French Revolution, right, during the more radical phase. So here we are again, some of the Second French Republic is kind of looking back to the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. Um, and this is before Napoleon III comes into power. So what did they set up? So this is after the February 1848 revolutions. Um, so what they established first is a unicameral legislature. So again, just a one-house legislature. It's referred to as the National Assembly. They also want to have strong executive power, which is where the presidency of Louis Napoleon, or eventually Napoleon III, when he establishes himself as the emperor, is going to be very important, and we'll get to that soon. Also, the president of the republic is going to be elected popularly by universal male suffrage. And remember, good trivia question, good even multiple choice question, that France was the first country in Europe to have universal male suffrage. So they're leading the way in that sense in terms of liberalism. So, but also remember that when the Second French Republic is established, there's some coalition splits that take place. Remember how this is when Louis Blanc wants to set up the national workshops. A lot of the conservatives or moderates in government are very skeptical about that because they don't know how those can be financed. So we will see a turn towards conservatism when Napoleon III is elected president here in 1851. So why is Napoleon elected? Well, we discussed in the previous chapter that a lot of it just has to do with straight up name recognition. He's Napoleon's nephew. Oh, sorry, just moved over a little bit. It's the same with some of our presidencies in the United States. The idea that we've had two Bush presidents, we've had two Adams presidents, two Roosevelts, right? People see the name Napoleon and they look back to what kind of leader that person was. And if they favored some of their leadership, ultimately they're going to support them. Also, we're going to see that Napoleon was a good choice for middle class, for peasants who were really against the national workshops. They didn't like the kind of radical notions of the working class, so they saw Napoleon III as a more stable or what we call law and order candidate. He really wanted to prevent any kind of uprisings like what we were seeing in 1848. Um, he also claimed when he was running that he had a plan to eliminate poverty, and we'll see that to a large extent he was very successful with his economic reforms. So looking at the information in this slide, again, I just said that he's seen as a law and order candidate. So he wants to bring stability to France by satisfying all classes. But at the same time, he really does not like the socialist or radical reformers that exist in France. He would have been very against someone like Louis Blanc. He doesn't like the fact that socialism at this point, we'll talk about later in the chapter how some socialists evolved to become a little bit more pragmatic. But at the beginning of socialist thought, especially Marxist thought, remember that the idea was the only that a violent socialist revolution was inevitable. And of course, if you're president, you don't want to see violence in your country and you don't want to see a ton of class conflict. He is very much in favor of the conservative classes, and some examples of people who would be considered conservative at this point: the church, definitely, the army, property owners, so the middle class, especially people who live outside of the city. We have a lot of people who are still owning vast amounts of land, and of course people who are involved in businesses, the urban middle class. And what Napoleon does at the beginning of his presidency is he establishes some reforms to try to please the conservatives. And he has a motive behind this. What he wants to do is modify the current French Constitution so that he can be president for a longer period of time. Okay, but at present, the Constitution does not is is not going to allow him to extend his presidency. So some of the things he does to try to appease the conservatives. What's written down here is the Falloux law, and this is where the control of secondary education is actually going to be returned to the church. The government was in control of education for a period of time. So realize, of course, this gives the church a little bit more power, and this might make them more willing to support Napoleon being president for a longer period of time. He also institutes policies to favor the army. For a period of time, he disenfranchises a number of poor people, and he shuts down labor unions. So again, all these things are reaching out to conservatives, and what he wants is to be president for a longer period of time. So he's trying to scratch the backs of the conservatives. However, the conservatives don't scratch back. They do not grant Napoleon a second term. So Napoleon decides to take matters into his own hands and stay in power by issuing a coup. So this coup d'etat takes place in December of 1851. And at first, he's not emperor yet. All right, what he does is, remember how at first, when he was trying to appeal to the conservatives, he reduces suffrage, taking the vote away from the poor. Well, he brings that vote right back in 1852. And what we see is that people are still widely in support of Napoleon ruling. 92% of the people who vote decide to make him president for 10 years. So we see that he's not quite emperor yet, but he's kind of gone around the National Assembly to extend his rule. Then in 1853, he appeals to a plebiscite again, and this time we have 90% of voters agreeing to make him a hereditary emperor. So of course, hereditary meaning that the rule will pass through his family line, and what this is going to do is establish much more authoritarian rule. We're going to see for a period Napoleon dismisses the National Assembly, so he's ruling all on his own. And this is when the government changes names. The Second French Republic, which was pretty short-lived, it only lasts from the 1848 revolutions until this coup in 1851. Now the government's going to be called the Second French Empire. This is a nod back to Napoleon Bonaparte, who formed an empire in France and also extending to some other European countries through conquest during the Napoleonic Wars. So we see a lot of nods to the past in the names of the government. So how does Napoleon rule France? Well, there are actually two distinct stages. And one I actually elaborate on here, another one I'll leave the details to a future slide. The first 10 years or so, or the first 9 years of his rule, he is very authoritarian. Okay, so this is seen as the more conservative stage of Napoleon's government. And a lot of this is because he's trying to kind of stabilize France after a period of revolution and upheaval. He needs to do some things to lessen the power of radicals and conservatives, radicals and liberals, that is, and increase conservative control over the government. So we're going to see how this rule is much more authoritarian. And then the second phase, the final 11 years of his rule before he ends up being captured during the Franco-Prussian War, is where he starts to liberalize some elements of the economy, some political elements, but we're going to see why that is. Okay, so even though he is a very conservative person, you might ask the question, well, why is he instituting liberal reforms? There is a reason why, and we'll get to that. Okay, so let's get back to this direct and authoritarian rule. So some of the things that he's doing. First off, he's centralizing power, right? Prior to Napoleon's established rule, we have power divided slightly more. Remember that the National Assembly has more control, right? But he's establishing a much stronger executive when he takes power. Also, of course, to try to lessen the power of the radicals and some liberals, he's going to censor the press. Also, when there are elections, again, elections are relatively rare in these early stages. We're going to see that the National Assembly will strengthen a little bit once we get back to this period with some liberal reforms. But when there are elections, in this early phase of Napoleon's rule, the government only sponsors what we call official candidates. In other words, Napoleon is only going to back candidates for elections that he wants to be in power. So, even if elections appear to be democratic, mostly because of the government's influence, only the people that Napoleon is going to support or the conservative government is going to support are actually going to be elected. And so this is interesting, and this is one of the most important takeaways of Napoleon's rule, especially the early phases. What we're going to see is that a lot of other political leaders in Europe are going to look to Napoleon as a model. And the reason why that is because in the early phases of or especially in the sort of during the 1848 revolutions, when we thought of nationalism, we thought of that as aligning itself very much with liberalism. The idea that that you couldn't be conservative and be nationalistic at the same time. What we're going to see under Napoleon is that you can actually reconcile nationalism and conservatism. Remember that Napoleon, a conservative candidate, was elected by a plebiscite, both to be president and then to be emperor. And that shows us that the entire population is supporting him. They believe that France will be strengthened by having a conservative in power. So his economy is seen as one of the most significant victories, you could say, in his rule. This also shows us some of the liberal reforms that he establishes, and that was what was mentioned, the second part. So 1859 to 1870, we're seeing he's becoming much more liberal. All right, so what is he doing for the economy? One of the most important things is that he's helping build infrastructure throughout France. We talked about this in the previous chapter, right? So some of the things that he's helping establish in France, building railroads, building canals. Remember, widening roads, right? Here's an image of a boulevard in France, right? This also means that he was demolishing some of the lower income housing in the center of the city, and boulevards allowed people to live on the outskirts of the city. And oftentimes you actually had the rich living in the middle of the city. So, you kind of see a little bit of a restructuring of housing, and opening up the streets, making them much more accessible, much less prone to traffic, poor sanitary conditions, and so on. And speaking of poor sanitary conditions, he's also responsible for sponsoring a much more elaborate clean water and sewage system, which is going to obviously improve general public health. Also, all these infrastructure projects are going to give people jobs, right? You need people to help build the roads, railroads, sewers, all these things. So that's important. One thing that I didn't mention just now, but it's in parentheses here, remember how important the Baron von Haussmann's role was in sponsoring all these different projects to improve the city. Other things in terms of economic reforms, France is moving towards a much more kind of liberal trading system. And this is going to be very, very beneficial to France's economy. All right, when government loosens some of its previous regulations on the economy, we're going to see French exports double. All right, so between 1853 and 1864, France is going to be exporting twice as many things as prior to Napoleon's administration. He's also going to expand trade with Britain specifically. Remember, Britain was very industrialized at this point, so there's a huge benefit there. So they sign a liberal trade treaty with Britain in 1860, and we're going to see that this shows us really that France is kind of leading the way in terms of playing a huge direct role in stimulating the economy. This is one of the first times you see a modern state doing this. Also, in terms of banking, we talked about credit mobilier earlier. I believe in the Industrial Revolution chapter, realized that this is also helping fund industrial and infrastructure growth. France's metallurgical economy is going to actually grow so much that it rivals Britain's. So metals are going to be produced much more in France. And we're also going to see that France is going to finance infrastructures outside of the country as well. So there are going to be some in Russia, Spain, and Italy, and as far away as Egypt. The Suez Canal actually was sponsored by French people. Okay, the next section will talk about the political reforms in France, also some liberal measures.